The most disturbing things Emperor Commodus did worse than Gladiator. He was born Lucius Aurelius Commodus on August 31st, in the year 161 AD, into what appeared to be the most secure and enlightened house on earth. His father was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, whose meditations would echo through millennia as a testament to Stoic virtue, duty, and self-restraint. His mother, Faustina the Younger, was the daughter of Antoninus Pius, linking Commodus to a lineage that had presided over what historians would later call the Golden Age of the Roman Empire. For those who believed in the benevolence of fate, the succession seemed assured. Marcus Aurelius had broken a century of tradition by which emperors adopted the most capable man for the job. Instead, he chose blood. Commodus was raised in the purple, groomed from infancy to hold the world in his hands. Tutors were brought from the far reaches of the Greek world. Philosophers instructed him in ethics. Rhetoricians shaped his speech. Military men taught him the art of war. On paper, no prince had ever been better prepared. But even in childhood, there were signs. The Roman historian Aelius Lampridius, writing in the Historia Augusta, describes a boy who was not merely willful but fundamentally cruel. He is said to have once thrown a servant into a furnace for the crime of drawing a bath that was too tepid. Whether the story is apocryphal or not, it survives because it aligned so perfectly with what came after. Where his father saw the world as a web of duty, Commodus saw it as a theater for his appetites. When Commodus was proclaimed co-emperor at the age of 15, following the death of his younger twin brother, the expectations were immense. Marcus Aurelius took his son on campaign to the northern frontier, along the Danube, in an effort to harden him against the soft corruptions of Rome. For 3 years, Commodus lived in the shadow of war, surrounded by legions who adored his father. But he did not absorb his father's discipline. Instead, he grew resentful. The camp was cold, the food was rough, and the glory belonged to Marcus. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died, most likely from the Antonine Plague, a pandemic that had already devastated the empire for over a decade. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who lived through these events and served as a senator during Commodus's reign, Marcus's final words to his son were not a blessing. Dio reports that the emperor, weary and feverish, expressed a grim hope that Commodus would not prove to be the ruin of the state. Some versions claim Marcus even tried to have his son killed before his own death, fearing what he would become. Whether that is true or legend, the very existence of such stories tells us that even those closest to the throne sense the darkness coiling within the young heir. Commodus, now sole emperor at 18, did not linger on the frontier. He immediately negotiated a hasty peace with the Germanic tribes, a peace his father had been on the verge of turning into a decisive Roman victory. Then he marched his army back to Rome. He was done with mud and blood. He wanted marble, wine, and applause. The Rome he returned to was still, in many respects, the great city of the Antonines. The Senate still met, the court still functioned, and the machinery of empire turned with the efficiency of a system that had been refined over 2 centuries. But Commodus had no interest in any of it. He had been starved of freedom in the camp. Now he would gorge himself on it. For the first few years, the government was effectively managed by a circle of advisors, men like his sister Lucilla, his brother-in-law Claudius Pompeianus, and the praetorian prefect Perennis. Commodus devoted himself to pleasure. Hunting, chariot racing, banquets that lasted from noon until dawn, and a succession of lovers both male and female. This was not yet the reign of terror it would become. It was, instead, a period of slow rot. But even in these early years, the disturbing contours of Commodus's character began to emerge. He did not merely enjoy spectacles, he demanded to be the spectacle. He began to appear in the arena not as an emperor in the imperial box, but as a participant. At first, he hunted animals from the safety of a raised platform. Then from ground level. Then, increasingly, he began to fancy himself a gladiator, a role that horrified the Roman aristocracy. For a man of senatorial rank, let alone the emperor, to step into the arena was to descend into the realm of slaves and criminals. It was a violation of the deepest social taboos. Commodus did not care. He found in the arena something he had never found in the imperial palace: adulation without condition. The applause of the crowd was immediate, visceral, and total. Unlike the Senate, which whispered and schemed, the masses loved him for his strength and his willingness to spill blood. Commodus became addicted to that love. It would become the engine of his descent. By 182 AD, the first serious conspiracy formed against him. It was led by his own sister, Lucilla, a woman who had once been the wife of Lucius Verus, co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius. She had watched her brother humiliate the family name, alienate the Senate, and surround himself with low-born favorites. She gathered a group of senators and military men, and they planned to assassinate Commodus as he entered the theater. The attempt failed. The assassin, a man named Quincianus, hesitated, shouting a line that was meant to be dramatic: "The Senate sends you this." Instead of a killing blow, he delivered a warning. Commodus's Praetorian guards fell upon him before he could strike again. What followed was not justice. It was a purge. Commodus had the conspirators executed without trial. His sister Lucilla was exiled to the island of Capri, the same island where the Emperor Tiberius had conducted his own orgies of cruelty, and was murdered there shortly after. Her husband, Claudius Pompeianus, was forced into retirement. Senators who had even been acquainted with the conspirators were killed or stripped of their property. The emperor's paranoia, which had been dormant, now awakened. From this point forward, Commodus ruled not as a philosopher king, but as a man convinced that the world was arranged against him, and that the only response was the wholesale destruction of anyone who might threaten his pleasure. It is here, after the failed conspiracy of 182, that the reign of Commodus transforms from a story of incompetence and indulgence into something far darker. The next decade would see acts of depravity that surpass almost anything depicted in modern films, not because Hollywood shies away from cruelty, but because the historical reality is so grotesque that it strains credibility. What the film Gladiator shows us is a Commodus who murders his father, lusts after his sister, and cheats to win a gladiatorial contest. These are crimes, certainly, but they are personal crimes, the sins of a single twisted soul against a few individuals. The historical Commodus committed crimes against the state, against the city of Rome itself, against the dignity of the human body, and against the very concept of reality. As we move into the middle years of his reign, we must understand that Commodus did not simply ignore his responsibilities. He began to actively invert them. He would not merely abandon the empire, he would remake it in the image of his own derangement. And in doing so, he would commit acts so disturbing that even the Romans, a people hardened by centuries of brutal spectacle, began to whisper that the emperor was no longer human. The self-made god. The most chilling aspect of Commodus's reign is not the violence itself. Rome had seen violent emperors before. Caligula and Nero had carved bloody paths through the aristocracy a century earlier. What set Commodus apart was the systematic, ideological nature of his self-deification. He did not merely claim to be favored by the gods. He claimed to be Hercules reborn. And he expected the entire Roman world to worship him accordingly. This was not a spontaneous delusion. It was a calculated political and psychological transformation, engineered by Commodus and his inner circle to centralize power and eliminate any remaining checks on his authority. But it quickly spiraled beyond calculation into full-blown megalomania. Hercules was a fitting avatar for Commodus. The mythological hero was renowned for his strength, his 12 labors, his triumph over monsters, and, perhaps most appealingly to the emperor, his eventual apotheosis. Hercules had been a mortal who became a god through suffering and achievement. Commodus saw no need for the suffering part. He was already divine. He simply needed the world to acknowledge it. In 191 AD, Commodus formally renamed the city of Rome. Henceforth, it was to be called Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, the Commodian colony. The Roman people were no longer Romans, they were Commodiani. The Senate was no longer the Senate, it was the Domus Divina, the divine house. The legions were renamed the Commodian legions. The month of August was redubbed Commodus, and September became Hercules, after his patron deity. Every institution, every calendar, every public inscription was altered to reflect the singular fact that Commodus was the center of existence. Even the plebeian masses, who generally adored him for the spectacles he provided, must have found this unsettling. To rename the city that had stood for 1,000 years was an act of metaphysical vandalism. It suggested that Commodus did not merely occupy the throne, he intended to erase Rome itself and replace it with himself. But the renaming was only the bureaucratic layer of his self-worship. The physical and ritual layers were far more disturbing. Commodus began appearing in public dressed as Hercules. He wore a lion's skin draped over his shoulders, carried a massive club, and displayed a bow and arrows. He had his hair dusted with gold leaf to imitate the radiance of a god. He grew his beard long and wild, not in the manner of a philosopher, but in the manner of a savage. When he processed through the streets of Rome, he was accompanied by attendants dressed as mythological figures, the Muses, Apollo, the Amazons, all there to service the living god. He commissioned colossal statues of himself in Hercules garb. One such statue, described by Cassius Dio, showed Commodus standing with his club raised over a defeated lion, his features rendered in heroic proportions. The statue was placed in the very spot where the Roman people had once worshipped Jupiter Optimus Maximus. The implication was unmistakable. Commodus had not merely joined the gods, he had supplanted them. But it was in the arena that Commodus's divine pretensions took their most grotesque form. He did not hunt animals as a noble hunter might, with dignity, with skill, with the traditional weapons of the aristocracy. He hunted them as a butcher, with methods designed to emphasize not his prowess but his absolute domination over life and death. Cassius Dio, who witnessed many of these spectacles, describes them with a mixture of horror and contempt. Commodus would appear in the arena to kill animals that were not merely wild but were often brought in sick, chained, or otherwise rendered helpless. He would slaughter 100 bears in a single morning, not from the excitement of the hunt but from a kind of grim factory-line killing. Dio notes that the emperor's arrows were tipped with crescent-shaped blades that could decapitate an ostrich with a single shot, and that Commodus would then display the severed heads to the senators, forcing them to cheer while he held up the bleeding necks. On one occasion, he gathered all the men of the senatorial order who were missing a foot, men who had lost their limbs in military service, and had them tied together and covered with fish skins. He then forced them to crawl on their knees while he beat them with a club, pretending they were sea monsters he was subduing. The image is almost too absurd to be credible, but it appears in multiple ancient sources. For Commodus, the degradation of the elite was not merely political, it was theatrical. He needed to humiliate them physically, to reduce them to creatures in his personal mythology. He also killed exotic animals from across the empire, elephants, rhinoceroses, giraffes, tigers, hippopotamuses, often using weapons specifically designed to prolong suffering. The slaughter was so extensive that the supply of exotic animals from Africa and Asia was reportedly depleted. This was not sport. It was ritual sacrifice performed by a man who believed himself to be the god of the earth, culling creation for his own amusement. But the true horror of Commodus's gladiatorial career was not the animal slaughter. It was his participation in human combat. The film Gladiator depicts Commodus fighting in the arena against Maximus, a fictional general. In reality, Commodus did fight in the arena, frequently, but never against skilled opponents who could pose a threat. His opponents were either prisoners of war, criminals condemned to death, or disabled men whom he could easily dispatch. He would appear in the arena armed with his club and lion skin, and his victims would be handed swords made of lead or wooden weapons that could not harm him. They were not opponents. They were props. He did, however, charge the Roman treasury an astronomical fee for each appearance. According to Dio, Commodus demanded the enormous sum of 1,000,000 sesterces per appearance, money that was extorted from the senatorial class to fund the emperor's vanity. The senators were forced to applaud his victories, to shout, "Long live the emperor the victor," and to inscribe his gladiatorial accomplishments in public records as though they were military triumphs. This was perhaps the most disturbing element of all, the forced participation of the Roman elite in their own degradation. Commodus did not simply ignore the Senate, he made the Senate complicit in his fantasy. They were required to watch him butcher cripples and wild animals, to cheer for him, to pay for the privilege of witnessing his divinity, and then to record those moments as if they were the great achievements of Roman history. One of the most notorious episodes occurred when Commodus killed a man who was missing a foot, replacing his foot with the likeness of a snake's tail, and then pretending the man was a giant serpent, a monster from Hercules' labors. The man was a living human being, probably a prisoner or a disabled veteran, and Commodus transformed him into a creature from mythology so that he could claim to have reenacted the labors of Hercules. After the killing, Commodus would stride to the center of the arena, strip off his blood-soaked lion skin, and accept the adoration of the crowd as a god. He did not stop at claiming to be Hercules. He also began associating himself with the god Jupiter, the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon. He had his own busts sculpted with the attributes of Jupiter, the thunderbolt, the eagle, the divine majesty. But whereas previous emperors had been deified after death, Commodus insisted on being worshipped as a living god. Temples were erected in his honor. Priests were appointed to his cult. The imperial cult, which had always maintained a careful distinction between honoring the emperor as a divine figure and worshipping him as an actual god, collapsed entirely. Commodus demanded sacrifice and prayer. The psychological implications of this are staggering. Commodus was not merely vain. He was engaged in a wholesale reconstruction of reality, one in which he was the sole author and protagonist. The Senate, the people, the army, all were characters in his drama. The gods of Rome were either his servants or his predecessors. The empire itself was merely his stage. This level of self-worship inevitably bred paranoia. If Commodus was a god, then any challenge to his authority was not merely treason but blasphemy. And Commodus, increasingly isolated in his palace, surrounded by sycophants and terrified courtiers, became convinced that the entire world was conspiring against him. The purges that followed the Lucilla conspiracy were only the beginning. In the mid-180s, Commodus turned on his Praetorian prefect Perennis, the man who had effectively run the empire for several years. Perennis had grown powerful, and his sons had been placed in key military commands. Rumors reached Commodus, whether true or fabricated, that Perennis was planning to overthrow him. Without trial, without evidence, Commodus had Perennis and his family murdered. His body was thrown to the mob. In Perennis's place, Commodus elevated a freedman named Cleander, a man of such corruption that his name became synonymous with the venality of the regime. Cleander sold public offices, provincial governorships, and even military commands to the highest bidder. He accumulated a fortune that rivaled the imperial treasury itself. Commodus, lost in his world of spectacles and self-worship, allowed Cleander to run the state into the ground while he played Hercules. The situation became so dire that in 190 AD, a grain shortage sparked a popular uprising. The mob, starving and furious, marched on the palace. Gladiator, fearing for his life, sent the Praetorian Guard to disperse the crowd. Instead, the guard massacred hundreds of unarmed civilians. The violence escalated until Commodus, finally stirred from his pleasures, realized that he might lose control of the city. He did what he always did when a subordinate became a liability. He had Gladiator executed and threw his body to the mob, who mutilated it and dragged it through the streets. Commodus emerged from this crisis not chastened, but more convinced than ever of his own divine invulnerability. He had not merely survived, he had been proven, in his own mind, to be the one constant around which the empire must revolve. He now plunged headlong into the final, most disturbing phase of his reign. The arena emperor and the degradation of Rome. The year 192 AD marks the absolute nadir of Commodus's reign, and perhaps of the Roman Empire itself before its later crises. In this year, Commodus abandoned all pretense of governing. He ceased to appear before the Senate. He ceased to hear embassies from the provinces. He ceased to communicate with the army. He lived almost entirely in the imperial palace and in the amphitheater, emerging only to participate in spectacles that grew increasingly bizarre and brutal. He announced that he would assume the consulship, the highest elected office in Rome, not once, but repeatedly. He planned to be consul every year, and each time he would enter the arena from the consular box dressed as Hercules, slaughter animals and disabled opponents, and then claim that he was inaugurating his consulship with the blood of monsters. The consulship, which had once represented the pinnacle of Roman civic virtue, became another prop in his personal theater. But it was his appearance as a gladiator that most scandalized the Roman elite. Gladiators were, in Roman society, the lowest of the low, infames, men who had forfeited their dignity and legal standing by entering the arena. They could not vote. They could not hold office. They could not even be buried with full honors. For Commodus, the emperor who held the tribunician power, the supreme commander of the Roman army, to appear as a gladiator was to invert the entire social order. He did not merely appear once as a gladiator. He appeared hundreds of times. He took the gladiatorial name secutor, meaning chaser, and he had his gladiatorial accomplishments inscribed on monuments. He commissioned a gold statue of himself in gladiatorial garb, armed with his club and lion skin, and placed it in the Senate House, the very building where senators had once debated the fate of empires. Now they were forced to conduct their business under the gaze of a statue depicting their emperor as a slave fighter. Cassius Dio describes the scene when Commodus appeared in the arena for one of these spectacles. The emperor, Dio writes, came down from the palace in a triumphal procession, accompanied by his fellow gladiators. He threw off his purple robes and donned the simple loincloth of a gladiator. Then he took up his weapons and entered the sand. The crowd, which had been carefully seeded with imperial agents, erupted in rehearsed cheers. Commodus then proceeded to dispatch his victims, always helpless, always outmatched, while the senators watched in silence, their faces masks of fear. After each victory, Commodus would approach the imperial box where the most prominent senators were seated. He would hold up his blooded sword and wave it at them, smiling. They were required to shout, "You are the Lord, the first of the gladiators, and glory to the victorious." Some senators, according to Dio, would bite their own tongues or stuff their mouths with cloth to avoid being forced to utter the words. But most complied, because the alternative was death. The sexual morality of Commodus also descended into realms that shocked even the libertine culture of 2nd century Rome. He kept a harem of hundreds of concubines, drawn from both sexes, and his appetite for novelty led him to practices that ancient sources describe as beyond naming. He was said to have taken pleasure in the humiliation of married women of the senatorial class, forcing them to appear in his palace dressed as prostitutes. He had a favorite concubine named Marcia, a woman who had once been the lover of the emperor's assassin, the freedman Eclectus, and he treated her with a mixture of dependence and cruelty. But it was his relationship with his own body that perhaps revealed the deepest pathology. Commodus was physically powerful. He was tall, handsome, and exceptionally strong. But he was also covered in the scars of his own excess. His drinking left him bloated. His constant exposure to the arena gave him wounds that he wore like medals. He dyed his hair blonde and sprinkled it with gold dust. He plucked his beard and his body hair. He wore makeup. He had himself painted in the likeness of a god, and he demanded that his subjects address him as such. One of the most disturbing episodes from this period involves Commodus's treatment of a man named Julianus, a former consul. According to the Historia Augusta, Commodus had Julianus thrown to wild beasts in the arena for no other reason than that the emperor had grown tired of his face. The man's family, his wife and children, were forced to watch as he was torn apart. Then Commodus ordered that the family be executed as well, so that no one would be left to mourn him. The message was clear. Commodus did not merely kill his enemies, he annihilated them, root and branch, erasing their memory from the earth. He also developed a fixation on the city of Rome itself. Not content with renaming it, he decided to rebuild it in his own image. He planned to tear down the entire Palatine Hill, the center of imperial power, and construct a new palace complex that would dwarf anything ever built. He wanted to rename the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, the Commodian Amphitheater, and to have his statue placed at its entrance, replacing the colossal statue of Nero that had stood there for generations. He envisioned a Rome that would be, in every sense, Commodus's city. The cost of these projects, combined with the corruption of Cleander and the endless spectacles, drained the imperial treasury. Commodus responded by confiscating the property of wealthy senators on trumped-up charges of treason. He would accuse a man of having consulted astrologers about the emperor's death, a common charge in paranoid regimes, and then seize his entire estate. The trials were a mockery. There was no defense, no appeal, no mercy. The accused would be executed, often in the arena, and their families would be left destitute. This period saw the rise of a new class of informers, delators, who made their living by spying on the aristocracy and reporting any hint of disloyalty to the emperor. These men were rewarded with a portion of the confiscated property, creating a perverse incentive to destroy the wealthy and powerful. The Senate, once the most august body in the Roman world, became a collection of trembling men who dared not speak to one another for fear of being overheard. By the autumn of 192, Commodus had descended into a state of such madness that he began planning his most audacious spectacle yet. He announced that on January 1, 193, he would appear in the arena not as a gladiator, but as the consul, and that he would then proceed to slaughter all the spectators. According to Dio, Commodus planned to have the crowd of Roman citizens, the people of the Eternal City, penned into the Colosseum and then shot down with arrows from his imperial box. He wanted to reenact the labors of Hercules one final time, this time with the Roman people as his monsters. He also announced that he would burn the city to the ground, beginning with the Senate House, and then move the capital to Alexandria, where he could be worshipped as a god without the hypocrisy of the Roman aristocracy. He had already begun stockpiling weapons and training his personal guard for the massacre. The plan, if it existed in any coherent form, was never carried out. But the fact that Commodus could conceive of such an act, that he could imagine murdering the entire population of the city he was meant to rule, tells us everything about the nature of his madness. He no longer saw Romans as subjects. He saw them as obstacles to his apotheosis. They were either worshippers or victims. There was no middle ground. The conspiracy that finally ended Commodus's life did not come from the Senate, which had been too thoroughly cowed to act. It came from the people closest to him, his concubine Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the praetorian prefect Letus. These three had watched Commodus's madness escalate beyond any acceptable bounds. They knew about his plans for the New Year's spectacle, the massacre of the Roman people. They knew that if he carried it out, there would be civil war, and they would be the first to die. They also knew that Commodus had begun drawing up a list of executions that included their own names. His paranoia had turned even on his closest companions. The plot was simple. On December 31st, 192 AD, Marcia prepared a dish of the emperor's favorite food. Into it, she slipped poison. Commodus ate the meal and then, feeling the effects of the poison, retired to his bath. But the poison was slow to act. Commodus did not die. He vomited repeatedly, expelling the poison, and then demanded wine to settle his stomach. Marcia, Eclectus, and Letus, hearing that the emperor had survived, realized that their lives were now forfeit. If Commodus recovered, he would know that someone had tried to kill him, and his retribution would be apocalyptic. They could not wait for the poison to finish its work. They sent in a young athlete named Narcissus, a man Commodus had trained within wrestling and gladiatorial combat, to finish the job. Narcissus found Commodus in his bath, still weak from the poison, perhaps drunk from the wine he had demanded. The historian Dio, who may have spoken to witnesses, describes what happened next. Narcissus, a man of immense strength, strangled the emperor in the bath. Commodus, who had killed hundreds of men in the arena, who had imagined himself a god, who had renamed Rome after himself and demanded worship as Hercules, died naked and choking in his own bathwater, killed by a man he had considered a friend. He was 31 years old. He had reigned for 12 years. The reaction in Rome was immediate and total. The Senate, which had been living in terror for over a decade, gathered as soon as news of Commodus's death spread. They voted to declare him a public enemy. Hostis publicus. They ordered his statues pulled down, his inscriptions erased, his name removed from all public records. They voted to have his body mutilated and thrown into the Tiber, as was the fate of the worst criminals. In the end, they compromised. Commodus was buried, but his memory was condemned. The Colosseum would not be renamed for him. The city would once again be Rome. The Senate ordered a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, so thorough that his name would be obliterated from history. It was not entirely successful. We know Commodus's name because the Romans, for all their fear, could not help but record the horror of his reign. But the damnatio memoriae was real. His statues were recarved into the faces of other emperors. His inscriptions were chiseled away. The very fabric of the city was scrubbed of his presence. The empire that Commodus left behind was not the same empire his father had ruled. The Antonine Golden Age was over. The stability of the 2nd century, which had seen 5 good emperors guide Rome to its zenith, had been shattered. In the decades after Commodus, Rome would descend into civil war, economic collapse, and military anarchy. The Severan dynasty that followed would restore order, but it would be a different order, more militarized, more autocratic, more willing to accept the concentration of power that Commodus had pioneered. Historians have long debated whether Commodus was simply a bad emperor or something more pathological. The sources, Dio, Herodian, the Historia Augusta, are unanimous in their condemnation, but they were written by senators who had reason to hate him. Could Commodus have been merely a young man given too much power too soon, corrupted by flattery and isolated from reality? Or was there something fundamentally broken in him from the beginning? The evidence suggests the latter. Commodus exhibited signs of what we might now recognize as narcissistic personality disorder, megalomania, and possibly paranoid delusions. His cruelty was not merely political. It was gratuitous, inventive, and often directed at the powerless. His need to humiliate the Senate, to force them to participate in his fantasies, speaks to a psychological need to dominate that went far beyond the normal ambitions of an autocrat. He did not merely want to rule. He wanted to be worshipped. And when worship was not freely given, he demanded it at the point of a sword. The comparison with the Commodus of Gladiator is instructive. In the film, Commodus is a scheming, jealous younger brother who murders his father and covets his sister. He is a villain of personal passion. The historical Commodus was something far more disturbing. He was not a schemer, he was a force of chaos. He did not murder his father. Marcus Aurelius died of natural causes, and there is no credible evidence that Commodus was involved. He did not lust after his sister, or rather, his sister Lucilla hated him and tried to have him killed, not the other way around. The film's Commodus is almost sympathetic in his desperation for his father's approval. The historical Commodus had his father's approval and rejected everything it stood for. The film's gladiatorial duel between Commodus and Maximus is a satisfying narrative climax. The virtuous general defeats the corrupt emperor in single combat. In reality, Commodus never fought a skilled opponent. He never risked his life in the arena. He never faced a man who could hurt him. His victories were staged, his opponents were helpless, and his courage was a fiction. When death finally came for him, it came not from a gladiator's sword in the arena, but from a wrestler's hands in his own bathtub. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Commodus's reign is not any single act of cruelty, but the cumulative effect of his 12 years on the Roman psyche. He showed that the imperial system, which had seemed so stable under the Antonines, was in fact vulnerable to the madness of a single man. He demonstrated that there were no institutional checks powerful enough to restrain an emperor who was willing to abandon all pretense of duty. And he proved that the Senate, for all its ancient dignity, was powerless in the face of a man who could summon the Praetorian Guard and the mob. When Commodus died, the Senate attempted to restore the Republic. It was a fantasy. The empire had become too centralized, too dependent on the military, too accustomed to the rule of one man to go back to the old ways. But the attempt itself shows how desperate the senators were to erase the memory of Commodus. They wanted to pretend that the last 12 years had been an aberration, a nightmare from which they could awaken. They were wrong. The nightmare had already changed Rome forever. The legacy of Commodus is a warning that echoes through history. It is the warning of what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of a man who sees no limits to his own desires, who views other human beings as toys to be broken, who mistakes applause for love and fear for respect. Commodus was not the worst emperor in Roman history. Later emperors like Caracalla, Elagabalus, and Caligula would commit acts that rival his cruelty. But he was the first emperor to fully embrace the logic of absolute power, to live out its implications without restraint, and to leave behind a Rome that was permanently scarred by his passage. In the end, the most disturbing thing about Commodus is not what he did, though what he did was horrific, but what he represented. He was the proof that the Roman Empire, for all its grandeur, for all its laws and institutions, was ultimately just a system that could be hijacked by a single deranged mind. He was the emperor who looked at the greatest civilization the world had ever known and saw only a mirror for his own reflection. And when the mirror finally shattered, it took the empire with it.